One nation, one world. On Bristol's BCFM 93.2. Inclusive radio for Bristol.
Well, why won't MI5 tell us what they knew, how many times they met the Manchester bomber, Salman Abedi? Well, they argue national security again, only it wasn't, was it? So we're going to hear now from a former Army and Special Branch officer, Charles Shoebridge. But Martin, MI6 had this policy abroad very clearly, engaging jihadis to fight in places like Syria and Libya. MI5, what was their role? Because their role was to protect the British public from people like this. They've completely failed.
Well, I think there's quite a degree of overlap between what MI5 and MI6 do. We have got a very strong jihadi infrastructure in Britain because Operation Cyclone, the setting up of the Islamic International Brigade to fight in Afghanistan, was led by MI6 from Britain, which is why all of these people ended up here.
One of the most important things, I think, is whether we're getting proper scrutiny of MI5 from the press. And I asked Charles Shoebridge, a former Army officer and former Special Branch officer, about that yesterday. How close are MI5 to the media? Because they don't actually even have an official press office.
They like to suggest, of course, that they don't have a press office, and they're right, I suspect, in that. But then, of course, someone like me would say, well, you don't really need one when just about every mainstream home affairs or security correspondent acts as a press officer for you. You'll find it's very rare that you'll find criticism of MI5 in the media. In fact, it's quite interesting for me to see over the last weekend where you had, for a very rare occasion, where MI6 is being criticised by Peter Oben, a very distinguished journalist that I've got a lot of time for. But throughout the whole article, there's another narrative running, which is that how excellent MI5 are, and that MI6 have somehow dropped MI5 into trouble by facilitating jihadists aboard. There are two problems with that argument. The first is that up till at least 2013, and I've tracked this quite in some detail, up to at least 2013, MI5 was complicit in the movement of jihadists to places such as Libya, Syria. And we can know that because you've got a situation where, even though it's been unlawful in the United Kingdom since 2006 to take part in terrorist activities or fighting activities overseas, until around 2013, despite the fact that in 2011, 2012 and 2013 you had many British people going overseas to Libya and Syria to fight against Gaddafi and Assad, nothing was done to stop those people from going there. And the legislation was there, and indeed is now used to stop people. And the reason for that, in my mind, and I said so at the time, and it seems to have been borne out, was that because those people going to places like Libya and Syria were actually on the same side as British government policy. They were going there to fight against Assad and Gaddafi to destabilise those countries. And as we know, the destabilisation of Syria is absolutely key to the geostrategic plans of countries such as Saudi Arabia and Israel in particular, because, of course, Syria is an ally of Iran, which is the enemy of those two countries I've just mentioned. And so you can see how it fits into the geostrategic plans. And that's why I'm always keen to say, well, when I'm actually pointing out that MI6 has facilitated, without any doubt in my mind, the movement of jihadists, for example, from the UK to Libya and then from Libya to Syria, just as happened in the past, for example, with Afghanistan in the Soviet years, with Bosnia, with Chechnya, the movement of British jihadists to these places to fight. They think they're fighting jihad, but actually they're fighting as well for what is perceived by the British establishment to be British geostrategic interests. And so people think I'm criticising MI6 when I say that. I'm not. And in a way, it's a backhanded compliment. It's singing their praises, that they are an extremely effective body in orchestrating the destabilisation and, in some cases, even the downfall of what British government policy says are enemy regimes or enemy governments.
Of course, MI5 aren't able to deal with the blowback, Martin.
Well, I mean, the idea that they're incompetent is obviously the sort of thing that the mainstream media might start to suggest, like the Daily Mail and so on.
Yeah, but Peter Oborne has been saying they're doing a fine job, MI5. It looks as if they have fallen flat on their face here.
Well, I would tend to agree. In actual fact, we don't really know what kind of a job these organisations do because we're not allowed to know what they get up to.
Well, also, of course, we've got the family of the shot policewoman Yvonne Fletcher who've been denied justice after evidence was blocked on national security grounds. Now, this isn't an old story from 1984. That is the 16th of May. This year, 2017, in the Daily Telegraph. The prime suspect of the killing of WPC Yvonne Fletcher will not be prosecuted after police were blocked from using key evidence on national security grounds, it's emerged. Now, along with Lockerbie, the whole murder of PC Yvonne Fletcher was used to cook up a case against Gaddafi and against Libya, Martin, wasn't it?
Well, you will know that there was a very good dispatches programme analysing this murder.
It's called Murder in St James.
Murder in St James.
There was a two-part dispatches. Yeah.
Indeed, and the conclusion was that in fact she was shot not by people from the Libyan People's Bureau, but from somebody who was based in an observation point which was being manned by MI5, and the SAS's ballistics expert was interviewed in the film, and he said clearly, well, I can tell you now, it wasn't the Libyans who killed the police lady. She was probably shot by a sniper from a different direction entirely, all part of a process of making Libya
so is it
to look
okay
bad.
for MI5 or the CIA to shoot a British police officer and blame it on the Libyans?
No, it's not, but that's the sort of thing that goes on, and people shouldn't delude themselves.
Well, if
these are not good organisations run by nice people.
I'll put a link up to that on our show page, but I also spoke to Charles Shoebridge about accountability, because there seems to be absolutely no accountability for anybody that commits criminal acts who works for MI5.
The issue of accountability, of course, is key to this. Effectively, there is no accountability for the security services, MI6, MI5 or GCHQ. We've seen that again and again, where even decisions relating to the amount of the release of information to bolster government claims, allowing us to go to war, for example, in respect of Iraq. The whole load of claims that were made, particularly by MI6, regarding weapons of mass destruction, had a catastrophic effect on bolstering Blair's rationale for taking Britain to war, and because they were exploited by the media, even turned public opinion to have a short-lived support for that war. So these are very, very serious issues, not just in terms of deaths of many hundreds, if you include British soldiers, of British people, but also, of course, hundreds of thousands, if not more, people overseas that have suffered as a result of these catastrophic failures. But of course, in terms of MI6 and so on, in terms of what we're saying, of course, they may not even be seen as failures because they've achieved the greater aim. But in terms of MI5's stated role, which is to protect the UK from terrorism, these clearly are failures. But again and again, we've seen situations where GCHQ, for example, MI5, have admitted in the past that some of their officers have made mistakes or have, for example, accessed information, personal information, in the case of GCHQ, which they weren't allowed to. But in every case, there have been no prosecutions of officers. There have been no sackings as far as we know. All that we hear about are people who are whistleblowers against MI5 or GCHQ or MI6 who then go to prison, whereas the people who actually are making these errors don't seem to suffer as a consequence. In respect of oversight here, we've got the Intelligence and Security Committee is the only supposedly independent body, along with the Surveillance Commissioner and so on. But these people never, or it's extremely rare that they make any findings against the security services. It's almost unheard of. The response usually to MI5 failings in this way is to reward failure by increasing their budget, because the argument is made, and it's being made every day now in our newspapers, that the reason for this is because MI5 doesn't have enough money. Apparently they need enough to be able to keep everybody under surveillance all the time. That seems to be the logical outcome of the rationale they're putting forward. And as I mentioned, that isn't the basis of intelligence work. Intelligence work should be about your decision-making, where you actually apply the very substantial resources they've already got. Think about the ISC, the Intelligence Security Committee. Its reports go to the Prime Minister first. Doesn't report to Parliament in the same way that other committees do. Its members are appointed by the Prime Minister rather than elected by MPs. And so it's a very limited form of oversight. And if you remember when we had the sort of spectacle of about 3 or 4 years ago of the heads of MI5, MI6 and GCHQ being grilled, as the newspapers called it, live on TV for about an hour by the Intelligence Security Committee. And it then emerged, as I predicted actually at the time, live on Twitter, that actually they had been given all the questions beforehand in advance, agreed those questions, and had, of course, had a chance to prepare and rehearse their answers, and it appeared to me rehearsed at the time. And so you've got a situation that is extremely limited oversight. And all we can hope for in terms of accountability and actually even documentation being produced and information being released is through other processes such as the inquest process and also the perhaps leaks from foreign intelligence services and so on. But again, increasingly there's movements towards more secrecy in courts when it comes to these kinds of issues. And so I'm afraid that when it comes to accountability, the direction of travel is probably to being even less accountable than the intelligence services are now.
That's former Special Branch and Army Officer Charles Shoebridge. Now, Martin, what Charles is saying there, that despite regular failings by MI5 and desperate need for accountability if we're to save British lives, the travel is in the opposite direction.
Well, I would go further than that. I think when you're dealing with terrorist incidents like this, the police should have primacy. The reason being that we have good reason to believe that Western intelligence services, NATO intelligence services, including MI6 and MI5, are potential suspects. That may sound extreme to some listeners, but it's not. It's something that's actually got to be taken on board.
Now, Charles Shoebridge mentioned Israel there and saying that quite a lot of these policies that the MI6 have been pursuing with these jihadis represent useful foreign policy decisions for countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Israel.
Well, indeed. I mean, all of this stuff may be fulfilling geopolitical goals, but is it legal? And is it what our intelligence services ought to be doing if they were under democratic control?
And as I said,
the answer is no.
As I said at the top of the hour, it's 50 years since the beginning of the end of the UN Charter. Would you agree that that was what the 1967 Six-Day War represents? It was with Syria, Jordan and Egypt, and there was an agreed division of Palestine between those countries. The Israelis grabbed virtually the lot, didn't they, including the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem.
Well, it's the source of the occupation.
And the Golan Heights.
It's the source of the occupation, which has continued ever since, which is the fundamental problem in the Middle East that's still not been resolved. And it's important to remember the 50 years since the Six-Day War, and also, of course, the USS Liberty incident, in which the Israeli Air Force tried to sink a US spy ship, killing 30-odd sailors, because they were doing it with planes which looks as if they were Egyptian planes. So the purpose of it was to try and provoke America into a war with Egypt. It didn't happen, but scores of American servicemen were killed, and then the whole thing was just brushed under the carpet.
Martin, the Golan Heights was also taken as part of that war, which is now involved. Of course, it almost seems as if there's been a kind of continuous running sore in that part of the world ever since then, which has been developing. Now the Russians have come in. What is the future for places like the Golan Heights, where people like Rupert Murdoch and other rich people in the Western world, the sort of people that would be at Bilderberg, have got oil concessions now there?
Yeah, well, I think that's another reason why they'll want to hang on to it, because they've found oil in the Golan Heights. And, of course, the Golan Heights is being used as a support area for jihadi terrorists operating in Syria.
But hang on, it's controlled by Israel.
Yes, I know, but it doesn't make any difference. The Israelis allow them to come over the border to get medical treatment, and then they filter them back into the battle. And the Israelis, just like the British and the Americans, are also flying air support for Al-Qaeda in Syria. And then we go on about, where did all these jihadis come from? Well, you created them, you armed them. The SAS in Libya trained these people from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. They went over to Libya and were trained by our people that we pay for. We trained them, and then they come back and blow us to pieces.
So where is it heading, this policy in the Middle East? Because the Russians have now put their foot down, haven't they?
Well, the Russians are trying to be calm. They're trying to negotiate rather than chuck their weight about, which is not the way it's presented in the West. The real danger here is we're going to have a tripwire, and we're going to have a major all-out confrontation with the two major blocks trading missiles, tanks, bombs, machine guns, the lot. This is the 100th anniversary of 1917, the Battle of Verdun, the Russian Revolution. I mean, all of these things, the world economy is teetering on the brink. They'll be discussing that at Bilderberg. I mean, this could all go very wrong very quickly, couldn't it?
OK, well, on that gloomy note, Thank you, Martin. But actually, on the positive side too, of course, we've got some real coverage. If you'll go onto our show page of the Bilderberg Conference and who are going to be our next leaders in the West here, at least Bilderbergers will be trying to make our new leaders at thisweek.org.uk. But it's time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 7 now. Coming up on Facebook Live, maybe. Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. It's Arabian Nights with Mohammed Makawi and Yusuf. Thanks to our guests in the first hour. Jeff Gollop from the Conservatives, Jude English from the Greens, and Asher Craig from Labour. Also, thanks also to Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, to Charlie Skelton and Luke Rudowski over in Chantilly, Virginia. Our sister show Dialects here at BCFM at noon every Tuesday. This show's story links and comment page, as I said, thisweek.org.uk. You'll find me on Twitter at Tony Gosling, who's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. I'll leave you with music from 1970, the Goth Rockers, Black Sabbath. Do please use your vote and join us for the election results at the same time next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.